Okay, so today is day 30 of Bible in 90 Days, or What's in the Bible, where we're going through the entire Bible, reading it from Genesis all the way to Revelation, just to get an idea of what the story of the Bible, what does it talk about, in the same way as somebody would ask you to summarize a book or summarize a movie or summarize an experience or whatever. I think as Christians, we should be able to know, what the Bible actually, what the Bible actually talks about. But being day 30 is actually a rest day in the calendar, that you version gives us to so if you don't have a U version Bible app, it's a really good app to to read the Bible in different translations, see different plans, connect with your friends and stuff like that. So U version is great. So thank you, U version, for Bible in 90 days. It was actually initially created by a guy called Ted Cooper, so thank you again to Ted Cooper. I have no idea where he is, or whatever, but thank you to Ted Cooper. Thank you to all these guys that have trailblazed for us, for the people that translated the Bible, for the people that were faithful enough to continue with whatever work needed to be done to make sure that we have this Bible today in a way that we can we can read and enjoy. So being that it's a break day, I thought, well, it'd be good to do a recap of what we have read in the last 30 days. So I'm going to try for the last 30 days just to see what it is that we have read, or what the story is to this point. So I might go back and forth or whatever, because I didn't make notes this time around. But anyway, we'll see. We'll see how far we get through with that. The other thing as well is the reason why I'm recording inside is because my microphone is broken after 30 days, and it's raining outside. So I thought I might as well just do it inside the car. So we're going to do a recap from Genesis all the way to First Chronicles, where we are now. So Genesis, we know that God created the world. He created the world in 7 days, or he created it in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. When he created it, he said it was perfect. It was good. He says, I think it's 2:31, that says he saw the world and everything that he had created, and it was very good. So it was perfect. Everything according to how he wanted to be, was there. So we know that, for a fact, when he created everything, so the stars, the moon, the sun, the vegetation, the animals, the rivers, clouds, whatever it is that you can think of, it was created, by God. So also human beings were created by God. So we know the first human beings, Adam and Eve, they were created by God. They were put in the Garden of Eden. There was two trees in there, two special trees. One tree was called the tree of life, and the other was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they were told not to eat from the one of of good and evil. But anyway, everything was great until we get to Genesis chapter 3, where the serpent deceives Eve as well as Adam to actually eat of the tree of the knowledge of good, and evil. And this is how sin enters, the world. So they disobeyed God, disobeying a command, disobeying the word that God had told them as to what they could and could not do. So for that reason, that's how sin entered the world. Because that happened, God then comes into the place and says, okay, he curses Adam, for what he did. He curses Eve. He curses, the serpent. And that's why it's called the fall, basically, where sin enters the world, and the world is no longer perfect in the way that God created it. So that's important, I think, to recognize. So from that point, from Genesis chapter 3 all the way until we get to Revelation 22, right, that's basically God restoring or redeeming the world to get it back to the perfect state that he wanted, or to create a new version which is perfect in in his eyes. So what then happens is Adam and Eve, they have two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain ends up killing Abel because he was jealous of his offering, because his offering was accepted and he as a person was accepted by God, and Cain wasn't. Cain is cursed by God at this point. Then he goes away. Then Adam and Eve have another son called Seth, which we're going to follow. So what happens is you get a little story, a burst, then you follow somebody, then something else, then you follow. That's basically how it's going. So we're not going to see what happened to Cain after he left. Yes, we hear a bit about his descendants and stuff like that, but now we follow with Seth. So Seth, along the way, one of his descendants is actually called Noah, right? Noah was a righteous guy. He found grace. He found grace with God. Then what then happens is the world becomes so sinful, because obviously sin had entered the world in Genesis chapter 3. The world becomes so sinful. It says that the plans of their heart were continually bent or intent on on evil. And God decided at that point to destroy the entire world with the flood so that they could start again. So he only saves Noah and his family, and that's where we hear about Noah's ark, etc. Then the world floods, and they go to to another place. So the waters recede, and at that point Noah and his wife, they've got three sons: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So the entire world is then repopulated by those three guys and their wives, etc. So whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever race or color or accent or language or skills or whatever you came from, either Shem, Ham, or Japheth. That's if you believe what the Bible says, which is another story. So we then follow again the story of a guy called Shem, right? So Shem, along the way, one of his descendants is called Abram, right? Abram has got his wife called Sarai. Then Abram is called by God. There's a covenant that is between God and Abram, and God said he was going to make him a father of many nations, and he was going to bless him, and he was going to do all sorts of things, and he was going to move him, to a land that he wanted him to be. So that land is then Canaan, or at this point he arrived in a place, I think it was called Shechem, at that point. So that was going to be, the land that God had apportioned, for him. So Abram was in his old age. They didn't have a son or whatever. Then God says he was going to give him a son of promise. But in the meantime, I think maybe there's a bit of impatience on Sarai's side or whatever happens, and then they end up having another son. So Abram sleeps with Haggai, the servant of his wife, and they have a child called Ishmael. Then Ishmael goes off and he has his own tribe, etc. And there's some drama there or whatever. But then Isaac finally comes along. So Isaac is the son of promise between Abraham or Abram at the time and Sarai, and they have that child. Isaac continues also his life. Things happen in his life, etc. We follow that story through until he has two sons, Jacob and Esau. So from Abraham to Isaac, now we've got Jacob and Esau. Esau does his own thing as well. Then we follow the story of Jacob, and he does some troubles, he does whatever he has to do. Then he ends up having 12 sons with I think about between 4 women, which is his first wife, his second wife, and the servants of the wives. But he has 12 sons, and these become the 12 tribes of Israel. Oh, you say, where did the word Israel come from? Because Jacob's name, he had an encounter with God, and it was changed to Israel. So when they say 12 tribes of Israel, really it's kind of like the 12 sons of Jacob, or the 12 sons of or 12 sons of Jacob. Anyway, so we continue. Then again, the story breaks off. Then we start to follow one of Jacob's son. His name was Joseph. So he is sold off by his brothers because they were jealous of him. So he goes to Egypt. And what happens after a time is that there is a famine in the entire world. Everybody's starving, no food anywhere except for Egypt because of the things that Joseph had put in place. At this point, he was now the second in charge to Pharaoh, and obviously he was in charge of everything that was going on. So this is how the reunion happens between Joseph, right, and his family, i.e. Jacob, the 12 sons, and all their relatives or whatever else, and they come over to Egypt. So at this point, everybody is coming to Egypt to get their food, and Egypt becomes this massive nation and stuff like that. So anyway, we then have all the Israelites. It was only 70 of them. So Jacob's sons and etc. They come over into Egypt, and they start to grow and multiply and grow and multiply, because that was the promise that God made to Abraham. So it was always going to happen that they would grow and multiply. But then, because of that growth and multiplication, we now have a Pharaoh who didn't know about Joseph and what he had done or whatever else, and he starts to oppress the Israelites whilst they're in Egypt. So this is now the book of Exodus. He starts to oppress them and oppress them and oppress them until they cry out. They cry out to God, and God says, listen, I'm going to save these guys. I'm going to take them out of this land of captivity and take them back to the promised land. That's why it's called the promised land, because it was promised to them by God, and they would have to go back then to to Canaan or Shechem or wherever Abraham was first, because they had only moved away from there because of the because of the famine. So God needs somebody to do this. Not that he needs a person, but according to the story, he gets Moses. He calls Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. Moses is helped by his brother Aaron, and they have to go to the Pharaoh and try and negotiate for them to go. Then there's a series of plagues, which are called the 10 plagues, where God is showing certain signs and wonders and miracles within Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelite people go. But obviously, he doesn't want to let them go, and back and forth, back and forth. But anyway, Exodus then ends with the killing of the firstborn. So all the firstborns of the Egyptians and their livestock, etc., was killed on this one night. But the sons and the firstborn of the livestock of the Israelites was not killed because of what was called the Passover. So they would kill a lamb and they would put the the blood on their doorposts, so that when the angel of death that was sent by God to kill all these people would pass over them. That's where we get the word Passover from. So that happens. The Israelites finally leave Egypt, and they start their journey. They're followed again by the Egyptians, but then God splits the Red Sea, and now they're on a journey on their way to the promised land. At this point as well, whilst they're in the wilderness, some things happen, and they are then given the law. So this is commonly known as the Mosaic law, or the Levitical law, where God is giving them as a people, because they had never been given this as a people. They have been given a set of rules and instructions and how to live in a way that would be pleasing to God. So that's where we get the 10 commandments from, and the rest of the laws. That's also where we get the Levites, because whilst Moses was up on the mountain getting some of the laws, etc., the people started worshiping other gods and doing things that they were not supposed to be doing. And by some interesting story, the Levites, or the tribe of Levi, end up being chosen as the people that were going to be the priests that would teach the Israelites how to behave and what to do, and things like that. So anyway, they come out of Egypt. They pass through the the Red Sea, and now they're in the wilderness, and that's how we get to Leviticus. So Leviticus is then now some details about all these laws that they were supposed to follow. So that's basically what about the offerings, about sexual immorality, about sin, and how to atone for it. So the word atone, because if you remember at the very beginning, God has said, if you eat of this tree, you will surely die. So sin from the very beginning would always lead to some kind of death, whether it was physical death or spiritual death or eventual death or whatever. So the reason why animals had to be killed or sacrificed, or their blood had to be shed, was because sin equals to death, and somebody has to pay for that sin. So that was the reason for the animal sacrifices and all the other laws that we are told of in Leviticus. So that's Leviticus. Then we get into the book of Numbers is when the Israelites are first numbered, and we find out how many they actually were. So I think it was about 1 million at that point, or over 1 million that that actually came out, and those are just the men that were counted over a certain age. We then get to hear about all the other tribes, etc. And now we hear about the journey of the Israelites as they're going through, the desert, the wilderness, the wilderness, etc. Going through. So they meet different kings or different nations, and different things happen, all sorts of things, and they win certain wars as they're on their way to to the promised land. At that point, 12 men are actually sent to the promised land, because they were getting closer and closer to the promised land. Now, after all these things are happening, they're sent to actually go and check out the land. Can we take it? What does it look like, etc. But when they come back with a bad report. Everybody starts to disbelieve God's promises, etc. And God, at this point, because they had been complaining and disobeying and doing all sorts of things up until this point, but this was almost the last straw for God to say, okay, you guys, you do not believe that I can take you back here, etc. So for all those that do not believe, which was the entire nation, they were told that they would not see the promised land. So all of them would die in the wilderness. So we then see another 40 years whilst they're in the wilderness, all of them dying away, except for Joshua and Caleb, because they were the only ones that actually believed that they could go there, and they believed God in these promises. So that's the book of Numbers. Then we get into Deuteronomy. So now that all these people have died in the wilderness that did not believe, but people were still getting born, they were now as a new generation. And Deuteronomy, it was written specifically, or at that time was specifically for that new generation that did not know about these things. So it's just almost like a recap of what the other people have been told in the laws, etc. So that's the entire book of Deuteronomy. Then we hear about the death of Aaron, the death of Moses, the death of Miriam, and now Joshua takes over, because Joshua is the one who actually takes the Israelites and leads them into into the promised land. So they get to the promised land in Canaan. It says there that God had fulfilled every promise that he made to Abraham, and how he would provide for them and take them in there, and that they would have the law. So this law was the covenant between God's people and God himself. So it probably just like a bicycle, actually, on my t-shirt here, that God had his part to play, that he would provide for them. He would make sure they would have peace, they would have no diseases, all these promises that were given to to the Israelites. But in return, or their side or their responsibility, was to follow God's commands and do things according to the way that he wanted to, and not to have any other gods, and live in the way that he wanted them to live, like as a holy and a priestly nation, so that this could continue as the bicycle, or as the way that they would move forward in their in their history. So that's where we are when they actually now get to the promised land, and everything is good when they get to the promised land. Then end of Joshua comes. Everybody's got everything that they need. Joshua, now he's finished his work, and Joshua, he dies. Then we get into the book of Judges, where that's where you see maybe the first warning signs, where it says, now a generation rose up that did not know about Joshua. They didn't know about Moses. They didn't know about what happened in the wilderness. They didn't know about the law or whatever else, or maybe they knew some of it, but they were just ignorant about it. And at this point, they then start to do the things that God told them not to do, right? But because the agreement was there already, so it's not as if it was a new agreement for every fresh generation. No, the agreement was already there. So they start to worship these gods. They start to disobey God and do all sorts of things. So every time this would happen, because according to the covenant, you can see this in Leviticus, I think 26, and Deuteronomy 28. Every time that would happen, they would be given over to their enemies. So enemies would come and raid them, take their food, take their children, or kill people, or there would be wars or whatever else. So every time this would happen, they would be taken captive, or oppressed by another nation. But God, still in his compassion, would raise up somebody called a judge, right? That's why the book is called the book of Judges. So people like Ehud, people like Samson, people like Barak, people like Jephthah, etc., who were the judges that God would send every time the Israelites were persecuted, so as to free them from from this oppression. But every time a judge would die, they would go back again into their sin, then another judge would come along, etc., etc., and it keeps going until that way. But at this point, everybody was just doing whatever they thought was right, because nobody was listening to the law that was given to Moses, and that they were supposed to follow. So we have a problem. Then at the very end, there's a really harrowing story about a Levite who gets his concubine raped and killed and whatever else, and it turns out it was the tribe of Benjamin, because remember there was 12 tribes, tribe of Benjamin, that did this. So all of Israel come, they make war with the tribe of Benjamin, and the whole tribe of Benjamin, except for about 600 men, are killed. And there's obviously all this wailing that they were going to lose a tribe. But this is how we actually find out why the tribe of Benjamin was the smallest tribe, because most of them they had been killed. So what then ends up happening is we get into the book of Ruth, right, which is almost a sideway, because it talks about this lady who was a Moabite, who then ended up becoming the grandmother or great-great-grandmother of David. But we don't know about David yet, so that's almost just a segue. But it happened in the time of the judges. That's why it is set that. Then we get to the book of Samuel, or First Samuel, because we were First Samuel and Second Samuel. This is when we get a guy called Samuel, obviously, who was like a judge slash priest slash prophet that God would talk to, and he would tell the Israelites what God wanted them to do. So Samuel was a great guy, great judge, great prophet, etc., and God would speak to him, and he had a lot of respect. But also eventually, after a while, Samuel also gets old, and he's about to die or whatever, so he gives his sons this office of priest and prophet or whatever else. But they do things disrespectfully. They don't like God, or they don't like what God had said for them to do. And then the people cry out for a king. But this was two ways. They were crying out for a king, one because obviously Samuel's children were not doing the right thing, but also because they wanted to be like the other nations. They wanted a king that would fight wars for them, or do whatever, or just a king for the sake of having a king. God then says okay, but he says he knew that it was really because they wanted to be like the other nations, and they didn't want God to be their king. But anyway, a process of selection then comes along, and from the tribe of Benjamin, the one that we just read about in the book of Judges, the smallest, comes a guy called Saul. So Saul is then the first king, of Israel. Saul being the first king, he fights their wars, he does all the things that kings would do, etc. But Saul, on a few occasions, I think there's two specific occasions that he disobeys God, and that was not cool. His disobedience, to God, and God tells him that he would, through Samuel, that he would rip away the kingdom from him and give it to somebody else, a man after his own heart. That's where after his own heart. That's where we get that terminology. So then we can get to see the rise of David, because we've been given anyway where David came from the book of from the book of Ruth. We see the rise of David, and the enmity between Saul, or how Saul hated David because he knew David was going to be the next king, and how David is to flee, and all sorts of things that happened in David's life. But we finally get to a point where King Saul dies, and David then becomes the king of Israel. And we hear that David was a good king. He made the people follow the law. He was helping the people. He'd give them food, etc. David was a great king, until when we get, so now we're in the book of Second Samuel. So we've gone through First Samuel, Second Samuel. At that point, Second Samuel, that's when David starts to make mistakes, and he sins as far as Bathsheba is concerned, where he sleeps with a woman that he was not supposed to, who was somebody else's wife. Then he kills the husband, etc., etc. Then when it comes over to the time for David to die, he then makes Solomon, his son, the king. So Bathsheba was actually Solomon's mother. At this point, Solomon is now the one who builds the temple. So a temple is a huge thing as far as the Bible is concerned, because all this time they just had a tabernacle, which had been built by Moses according to the instructions of God. But then we have this temple that is also built according to the instructions of God. And Solomon was super wise, very rich, and everything in Israel was this huge kingdom, and everything was great. It actually says that Israel was great, everybody was at peace, people had food, everything was brilliant, at the time of Solomon. Until Solomon, it said he had 1,000 wives, or 300 wives, and 700, concubines. And some of these were from the other places that they were told not to marry from, because they worshipped, different gods. So idolatry is a huge theme as far as the Bible is concerned. So because he then does that, he gives his time and his efforts, to building temples for these gods, etc. So it just then starts to get wayward, and at that point, God says, "Okay." He was going to rip apart, the kingdom of Israel, because of the covenant that he had made, or the agreement that he had with David. He would continue to, Solomon and his sons would continue to have something that they could rule over, which was the tribe of Judah. But then the rest of the kingdom would be given to another person. So at this point, the kingdom of Israel splits. So you've got the Judah side and the rest of the tribes on the other side. So with the first king of Judah, I think, is Rehoboam, and the first king of Israel is Jeroboam. Now, and this is where the problem, or the intensifying of the problem, whatever. So Jeroboam leads Israel into sin. He does not follow God's commands, because you would think after everything that happened maybe he would, but he doesn't. He creates his own religion, he installs his own priests, he starts doing all sorts of things, and leads the Israelites to sin. The same thing also happens on Rehoboam's side as they go along. So this sin continues and continues. So this is through the book of First Kings, and the book of Second Kings that we're reading, and it's just sin after sin. There were one or two kings that were great, people like Hezekiah or Asa or Josiah, who followed what God wanted, who tried to lead Judah in the right way. But eventually there was just so much evil that was happening, and things were going away from what they had agreed. Remember the bicycle covenant, or the covenant that they had. They were going so away from that God eventually then gives Israel and Judah off to the king of Babylon. So this is where we see Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, coming in, and he takes the entire Israelites and Judah into captivity, exile. They actually leave the promised land that they had been in for such a long time. So it's actually a sad point, in my opinion, in the story, where this eventually happens. Some of them run away to Egypt. Imagine Egypt, where they had come from, all those many years ago. They run back to to Egypt, and that's where we found ourselves just a few days ago. So when we get into First Chronicles, it's then just a bit of a recap of the genealogies and how far they had gone. Then, as we continue in the next 30 days, we'll then see what happened to the Israelites whilst they were in the in Babylon, and all the other nations that came up after that. Then when we get to day 70, that's when we'll be in the New Testament. But this alone, the stuff that we're reading now, will really help us to understand and grasp the concepts and the things that will be happening in the New Testament. Because without that, it's really hard to understand why certain things are done in certain ways, and why Jesus had to come, and why Jesus had to die, and why he had to go back, and why the Holy Spirit is here, and all those things, and why then Jesus is coming back at the very end. To understand those well, we need to understand what the what the Old Testament says. So I hope that's helpful. So and this might serve in case you have missed some other videos. Please still catch up on those videos. But this might be a good one to just say, okay, for the last 30 days, this is what we have read. And I'll say it again. This what I'm doing now. It's mostly for my benefit, because I know one day I'm gonna watch through the videos, etc. And if it's helping you, that's good as well. But you need to read your own Bible, because I might be missing stuff that you need. I might be seeing some stuff, that you might also see, but I might be missing some stuff that you might see, if you're reading. So this is a good introduction. Yes, it's a good maybe little tool that you can use to reference some things or whatever. But nothing beats reading it for yourself. So hopefully you'll be able to read, and even if it just piques your interest to say, oh, okay, I didn't even know that's what it was about. So, and you don't have to be a Christian to read the Bible. I would hope that everybody becomes a Christian, that you would become a Christian as well. But to read the Bible, you don't have to get a specific license or whatever. You just need a Bible, and you just read it, and it's free. You can get it on New Version, you can get it on the internet, whatever. So please read your Bible, if you can. So I'll see you guys tomorrow, which is actually in a few minutes, because I'm going to record tomorrow's video now, where we're looking at day 31. Okay, see you then.